We the dear righteous still in the Gullah Geechee Nation, and so glad for have the Secretary of the Department of the Interior of the United States, Sally Jewell, become here for cracking teeth with me. But what we can do to work together for keep this your land and waterway and things like that. So, honey, children, we want you for tuning in for this year with my partner from the America's Great Outdoors Initiative and things like that. And yet when we crack, we keep out right here in Oindor, South Kakalaki. And honey, children know if honey deal with me, honey going to know this year the work going on.
Welcome everyone to the Seaweed Visitor Center. It's great to see you here. With us today we have some very important people that we'd like you to meet. Our Deputy Regional Director, Michael Edker, on the left, is here with us today. And I'd like to turn it over to him to introduce the Secretary.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming over for this great opportunity that we have. Our Secretary, Ms. Sally Jewell, is now our 51st Secretary of the Interior, and she's been with us for about 7 months. She's made the Southeast very much a priority, and not just the Western lands that traditionally Department of the Interior focuses. So she has made has a great interest in the Southeast, and we asked her to come down here to help us focus on longleaf pine and some of the issues that we deal with down here. With her background, she has a great understanding of the intersection of natural resources and conservation, and how that plays in with conservation partnerships and land investments and land conservation. So with that, she accepted that opportunity to come down here, and I'll turn it over to her to say a few things.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Great. Well, welcome everybody. I'd love to kind of do introductions around the room, but there's so many of you, I'm afraid it would take too much time. So my apologies for that. Normally that's absolutely something I do, but I just want to say thanks for the great welcome to South Carolina. Had a really good meal last night. What was the name of the restaurant?
Hoogan's Porch.
Hoogan's Porch. I gather there were ghosts in there. I didn't see any, but it's not my first trip to South Carolina. I've had close friends in Charleston. I've enjoyed your coastline, spent a night out there. I think my first trip was hiking kind of in some hickory and maybe longleaf pine forests in the high country, which isn't right here. It's certainly in my job at REI, where we opened a store in Greenville, I went and looked for the mice in Greenville. I don't know if any of you have done that, but it's really fun. But most importantly, this trip, my first trip as Secretary of the Interior, I'm here because of the kind of work that you all do as stakeholders working closely together. You understand your ecosystem here, how important it is, not just to habitat and species, but also to history and culture that is so rich in this region. Whether it's the Gullah Geechee people of the region and the rich cultural history that goes back there that I was learning more about last night, to the original range of the longleaf pine and how important that was for habitat, to what's happening in the coastline. So 3 of us have just been flying around this morning along the whole Romaine National Wildlife Refuge, looking at the coastal erosion from the air, looking at the encroaching sea level and tidal erosion that's going on because of sea level rise, which you have right now. And Ray tells me it's 1 foot in the last 100 years, which is shocking to me. That's a lot of sea level rise in an area where you've just got a 6-7 foot tide and not a lot of elevation. So one of the reasons that I chose to come here was because of the connections you have in the community, understanding that it's the public sector at a local, a state, and a federal level, and then federal agencies working together, the Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Forest Service, which is part of the Department of Agriculture, but also the state, which has a whatever you call it, right north, the
Coastal Reserve.
The Coastal Reserve adjacent, and how the private landowners and the Intercoastal Waterway, which is the Corps of Engineers, and the impact of man on those things that are important to our economies and development, but also have impacts on the hydrology. And you understand all those things here. Also know that as we see coastal erosion, how do we mitigate for that? How do we prepare our communities I would not want to be in some of the houses that I saw if we had a Hurricane Sandy hit here, or as you saw with Hurricane Hugo back in the late 80s. How do we help prepare communities? What can we learn from our natural infrastructures and green infrastructures that we can apply to help communities continue to thrive in an environment of climate change? And you can see so much from the air, and we're going to be going out a little bit later on today by boat over to Bulls Island to see what's happening kind of up close on the ground. So I just appreciate what you have all been doing in working together in the community. I will say this, that the President's 2014 budget had some pretty significant money in it using the allocation of the Land and Water Conservation Fund to buy some critical parcels that actually will help connect, for example, the Remain National Wildlife Refuge with the National Forest Service lands. These kinds of things are really critical. As you lose beach habitat and it really moves inland, we need to make connections. Willing sellers, we could be a willing buyer if we've got Land and Water Conservation Fund money. And just for those of you, I'm sure a lot of you are, how many of you are steeped in the Land and Water Conservation Fund? Just show me your hands. Okay, so not everybody. So the Land and Water Conservation Fund legislation passed by a pretty enlightened Congress back in 1964, so its 50th anniversary will be next year, said if we're going to drill for oil and gas in the Outer Continental Shelf, which is federal lands and waters more than 3 miles offshore, there will be impacts, and the Gulf Coast knows that there are impacts, particularly after the devastating Gulf oil spill. Let's mitigate those impacts by using money from those offshore oil and gas revenues onshore in areas that are important to communities. And so there's both stateside and federal Land and Water Conservation Fund money that acquires land or conservation easements or hunting access across private lands to public lands, all kinds of uses. And over time, it has made a huge difference in setting aside really important habitat or important priorities for local communities. Sometimes it's ball fields, sometimes it's land for a state park. If it's local, it's matched locally so that there's joint ownership. And this is a very, very important program. It has only once been funded at the full level or appropriated at the full level of its funding, which is about $900 million a year. So members of this Congress, and actually several Congresses going back a few years, have tried to zero it out. The revenues coming into the Treasury is just not being appropriated to the Land and Water Conservation Fund in the level that was intended. The President's budget says enough of that. In 2014, the recommendation is partial mandatory funding. In 2015, it's full mandatory funding, so that the $900 million a year that is generated from offshore oil and gas revenue would go to fund this on a permanent basis, which is really critical to communities. So there's a number of parcels of land, I think about 4,000 acres or so in the Remain National Wildlife Refuge, for example, but others also in the National Forest, adjacent to national park lands. And it begins to cobble together ecosystems for the longleaf pine, but also the connections from the shore, as we saw today, to the uplands. So I have certainly been helping elected officials understand the importance of the Land and Water Conservation Fund and why it helps from a local level all the way through to a national level, and why it's not just adding land that we have no money to manage, which as some would say. It actually, in some cases, provides buffer for invasive species. It enables us to manage the land more efficiently and more effectively. And for all of you, with an eroding habitat that's impacted by climate change, it gives you a chance to maintain the history and the culture and the habitat and the things that are important to South Carolinians through use of these resources. So that's kind of the overarching message, and I'm here to listen to you and to learn about your communities. And so what I would love is maybe just if we could, because the group is so large here, if you want to shout out things that you kind of like to have a dialogue on in this hour that we have together, that would be great. And
good morning, Sally.
Hello, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Glad if I have on a down yo with we. And of course, my interest is in furthering community collaborations and strengthening stewardship amongst your average citizens.
Okay, great. Yeah, back there.
Mine goes along with hers, public and private partnerships, and I'm with Charleston Audubon Board.
Public and private partnerships, terrific. Okay, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Climate adaptation, and how we could be working with our federal partners to face that challenge.
Great, and you're
Mariah Whitehead with the Nature Conservancy.
great. Thanks, Mariah. Yes, ma'am.
My concern are the kids in school, especially middle school.
Okay.
How can we invest in these kids to have more interest in our environment?
Terrific. Thank you. Other topics you'd like to cover? Yes, ma'am.
I'm a sweetgrass basket maker. We used to have permission to go in the forest to gather pine. Now they don't give us no permit anymore.
Okay.
So I don't know if they're interested, so we could go back and get the pine needle. We use the long ones.
The longleaf pine needles? Okay.
Many people are working on preserving the resources here, many organizations, and one of the things we're faced with is major in-migration and development, and wondered the degree to which from Washington there will be support for an emboldened defense by federal agencies of their resources. I mean, helping to protect the forest. To what degree can the agencies themselves be proactive in the face of that with local issues? Or are they constrained by rules from Washington?
Oh, you mean, you're talking about local federal agencies want to do things and how much are they constrained by Washington?
Yeah, I mean, you have major zoning issues come up, you have major development issues come up. Is it reasonable to expect a proactive approach from the agencies, or do they have to look to others to build the defenses around them?
Okay.
Yes, Griffin Lodge from the Gullah Geechee Country in this quarter. I would say with the land conservation and diversity, with a dying culture, it seems like it should be a better marriage there, because what has been happening with the culture itself, which is tied to the land, with the pure blood, which those of us that are here, Commissioner Sanders, the Queen, and myself, that we live this, it seemed to be a disconnect in the sense of land conservation and the culture itself that's dying off the face of the earth. Lack of understanding, I'm not quite sure what all of the answers should be, but I think it should be a better marriage.
Okay. Great. We got plenty of time. Okay, thank you very much for that. It gives us a sense of kind of how to manage the time that we have remaining together, and as long as I can read Ray's handwriting, but make sure we kind of touch on all of them. Before I kind of get to, because this isn't like I have all the answers, believe me, it's not, because I don't. But I have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and love to do some listening. Are there any anecdotes or stories you'd like to share with me about what you do here that helps support the ecological systems and so on you have? Yes, sir.
Yeah, with the National Park Service and also the coordinator for the Gullah Geechee culture here at this corridor. I would say, me sitting in this room today with members of the commission and the corridor, the community folks, because my relationship is great. We're in the same family as the Department of the Interior. We don't cross paths with the same lands, but we have the same preservation and conservation thought process. And I can tell you, Madam Secretary, that the National Park Service in this area and the Fish and Wildlife Service have a very strong bond.
Great.
And that cross, whether it's ecological, whether it's culture or preservation. And so one word of advice I would share with you is finding ways of the family members working together. And being that the fact that I'm responsible for the corridor, which traverses 4 states, there are many National Park Service sites in the corridor, as well as Fish and Wildlife Service sites. And we realize this is a shared responsibility. And so any way that we can utilize these opportunities for the shared responsibility, I think the community benefits.
That's great.
And I think it also develops collaborative opportunities. So I just want to share that with you as an anecdote and a story.
And I know it's true with the Forest Service. Very helpful last night to have a conversation about what's happening on the ground. I mean, that is very important for me to know. So Sarah was telling me last night, the refuge used to have 13 employees. It's now down to, is it 5? 5 employees. 66,000 acres, 22 miles of coastline, 5 employees. And so it's very difficult. Sequestration has an impact. You mentioned it on state resources. Sequestration is a law. It's a law that was passed by Congress. And we have to implement the law, which is my job. And there's parts of the laws that I have to implement that I really don't like, and this would be one. as a business person, 35 years in business, you would never manage a budget by cutting things across the board. You would never manage a budget by saying, oh, somebody retired, therefore that position goes away, right? But that's what we have to do right now. You would never manage a budget by saying, your costs are required to go up, but we're reducing your budget, and therefore you have to eliminate people because that's all you've got that you have any control over. And oh, by the way, you can't eliminate people because of federal laws. And so you have to wait for them to retire. And oh, by the way, you may end up with a refuge that has, let's say, all maintenance staff and no biologists, or all biologists and no maintenance staff, or no volunteer coordinator, which makes no sense when you have lots of volunteers that are willing to help with your loggerhead turtle nests, or with invasive species removal, or other things, and yet you don't have anybody that can help leverage that resource. It makes no sense whatsoever. So anecdotes like I heard from Sarah last night over dinner are very helpful to me in going back to elected officials to explain on the ground what it's really like to be living in a sequestration world. It makes no sense. So we have got to get to a situation where we have recognition of the importance of these assets to communities, recognition of the importance of the work that federal employees do, and recognition of the ability that we have to leverage friends groups and volunteers if we're allowed to manage our operations in a logical way that isn't controlled at every turn. There are some in Congress who would like us to not be any good at what we do. Because they would like us to basically go away. Except when you have a shutdown and your national parks close. Right. And they recognize there's an economic impact because, as you were talking earlier and introducing yourself, businesses depend on wildlife refuges. People depend on wildlife refuges and national parks and national forests for recreation, for education, for breathing space, for clean water, for clean air, for the culture that makes South Carolina what it is, for the history, and you don't want South Carolina that has, no management, no thought to it. You want a South Carolina that reflects what's important to you in the community. So,
just wanted to add to the conversation, since I was a part of 4-H growing up, but because I'm also Gullah Geechee, as I always say to people, we are inextricably tied to the land, and I consider the land part of my family, and the waterway is my bloodline. So when we start talking about the engagement of youth, as a mathematician and computer scientist, I think you need to also consider teacher trainings that enlighten educators about all of what you said about using the outdoors as a classroom, but also the different dynamics of different components of what they have to educate students about that are outdoors. Because as a person who studied engineering and had to build bridges and all of this and graduated cum laude, all of that, I look at a rice field and I see mathematical equations naturally. But no one comes to me to ask me about working with them in partnership with all the environmental things in that regard. And you see, they always relegate it to, well, if Gullah Geechees are going in the woods, you're going to get sweetgrass, or get pine needles or those kinds of things, or hunt. But they don't look at the science behind what we were doing. So I would say to you to make sure that in all of the work, that you never negate the cultural and traditional components and what those communities can teach just because of the way we would naturally see an environment. Because, I worked on America's Great Outdoors Initiative, and I'm glad this is building kind of on that or continuing that. But I think that that's a part that gets mentioned, then gets forgotten. The cultural and traditional communities and all that they could bring to the table just because of the way they see the world.
I think it's a great point. It's a great point. Yes, sir.
With respect to environmental education for youngsters, I think it may be important for you to know that that's not done by the government. That's done by the Seawee Association, the Friends Group for the coastal refuges and the Francis Marion National Forest, both at Waccamaw and at Cape Romaine and at Ace Basin. Those efforts to instill that early education, hands in the dirt, hands in the water, type of education is really funded by our Friends Group. We have a full-time educator that is working many, many miles of coastline, many, many schools, many, many acres to try to introduce those children to the importance of environmental education.
Has that always been the case here in terms of the educational programs, or is it been impacted where more has fallen on your shoulders and with less support because of our budget circumstance?
I might be able to answer that
Yes,
if I might
thank you.
add.
Yeah, go ahead.
Secretary Jewell, I'm Grace Gaspard. I'm the executive director of the Seawee Association, the Friends Group to the Refuge. The Seawee Association was actually founded when this visitor center was open with the primary initial mission of providing environmental education. In the first years in '97 when we began, we were seeing about 75 students a year in the first 2 years. We're now seeing 13,000 students a year along the South Carolina coast, at Ace Basin, here at Cape Romaine, on the Francis Marion, and at Waccamaw. And our scientific investigation programs are very much focused on getting kids out and using our public lands as classrooms. The association has provided full funding for our programs, for our staff. Our refuges has very generously partnered with us in challenge cost share grants, which now, because of the budget cuts, will not be available. So more of that funding has fallen on our shoulders, which rightfully so. We're the Friends Group, and that's what we're here to do. But you know, the needs of our refuges are growing so fast. With the cuts in staffing they're experiencing, they're needing more support for us in terms of volunteer coordination for the programs like sea turtle conservation and shorebird work, which, as you know, is so critical in this area. So we are, although we have funded the education work, we're funding more like everybody else. We're looking for new resources to do that as the existing funding you know, sources change. We're in certainly a different world since 2008. Every nonprofit knows that. But more and more, you know, is being required by our refuges, and we certainly do everything we can to meet those needs.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, we believe, as you do, and are so happy to hear you know, your support for environmental education, and the other projects we support are equally important to us. So we have a tough task
Who
ahead.
funds you now? You got some grant money from Fish and Wildlife Service. You get.
We've had some challenge cost share grants as through the Fish and Wildlife Service, but all of our money for our education is raised through private donations from community and local foundations, and we're certainly working to expand those funding sources. But we're a 501c3 nonprofit, and we you know, fundraise for all of the projects and programs we support for our refuges.
Great.
And a very generous community that supports us, and wonderful partnerships, we hope, even more so in the future.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
No, private philanthropy, in my view, I mean, it's critically important, and friends groups, you know, they are absolutely, they should be the margin of excellence.
Yes.
Right now, friends groups are the margin of survival. We need to get back to where friends groups can be the margin of excellence.
Yes.
And your voices are really important in that, so that your elected officials can understand the importance of these refuges to the health and well-being of your children, of your communities, of your stories, and your history. This is a community that is supporting these refuges. That's not true in all across the country. But it is, one of the reasons I'm here is because we can amplify what you're doing. It's inspirational to others, but it's also illustrative of the function that can happen in a community when we do work together. You're doing a really extraordinary job here of working together. And you've got the unique Gullah Geechee culture and heritage here. You've got unique resources in terms of your wildlife refuges and your, you know, your tidal lands, your uplands. The longleaf pine forest, very important from cultural reasons, also very important from ecological reasons, is being replanted. Partnerships with companies like International Paper are really, really important as we try and restore some of this. There is a Landscape Conservation Cooperative, which is a multi-agency group looking at regions on a very large scale. And I would encourage you to look at your region on a landscape scale as part of a larger landscape, and to make the kinds of decisions that you can make locally that support your objectives here. And we as federal partners would like to be at the table with you in meetings like this and so on to make sure that we understand what we can do, like Land and Water Conservation Fund investments to link the eroding beachlands to the uplands, because that will be beachlands the way climate change is going. And you know, we may roll our eyes, but we're actually seeing this in our lifetimes. We're seeing changes in our lifetimes, and part of this is trying to address it at the source, but also part of it is adapting, and you are in a position where you can do something about it. And you can bring the science of understanding the landscapes for generations, as the Gullah Geechee people can do, but you can also bring current science to bear as well in understanding those things. And it's, I really look forward to getting out in the resource and learning more about it. These two have been great in educating me along with their colleagues, and so thank you for everything that you do in this region. You're a model in many ways for what you're doing with the rest of the country, and you have things that the rest of the country can learn from you. You probably have things that you can learn from people around the table that can make you even stronger, and so I encourage that ongoing dialogue, and thank you for the organizations you represent, for everything you're doing, especially in helping my colleagues here, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Park Service, and the Forest Service do their jobs with limited resources. And oh, by the way, Land and Water Conservation Fund, very important. Supporting these agencies, very important. We do live in a democracy. It responds to voter input, and make sure that your voices are heard with your elected officials, because they need to hear from you about how important this is to you and to the culture, history, and vitality of South Carolina. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Something I got in Africa. Oh, yeah. Africa. No, it's like good to see you too.
I have no idea.
You got a race here?
Hang on one second.
Thank you.